Welcome to the Latin American Perspectives podcast. My name is Tomas Ocampo, Outreach Coordinator at Latin American Perspectives. Today we will be discussing the main theme of the sub-articles of the November LAP issue, the resurgence of collective memory, truth, and justice mobilizations, culture, politics, and social mobilizations, with the authors Gabriela Fried Amilivia and Renzo Aroni. Gabriela is an associate professor of sociology and Latin American studies at California State University, Los Angeles. She is the author of State Terrorism and the Politics of Memory in Latin America, Cambria Press, 2016, and numerous articles on the politics of oblivion and transnational policies, memory, and trauma in post-dictatorship Uruguay. Renzo is a PhD student in the Department of History at the University of California, Davis. His research focuses on how social and historical memories of violence find creative or artistic expression in contemporary Peru, and he has researched the representation of the Ayakucho Massacre in Peru. So good morning to both of you. It's a pleasure to have you here with us.
My pleasure also.
Good morning.
Yeah.
For my first question, can you briefly summarize your article in the November issue? So for Gabriela, your article was Sealing and Unsealing Uruguay's Transnational Politics of Oblivion.
Yes, my work in Latin American Perspective, this issue summarizes and documents 30 years, so 3 decades of transitional politics in Uruguay. And just the length of the period already calls attention, right? So it's basically trying to capture the effects of state terrorism, the enduring effects of state terrorism into the transitional period. And the field usually is called transitional justice. And the limitation of that is that it didn't capture that a lot of the transitions, particularly Uruguay being a model of pacted transition, didn't really aim at justice or accountability, but they actually were very permeated by politics of impunity, which is what I'm calling the politics of oblivion. And oblivion involves impunity and involves a lot of other different policy effects. And so basically the article is trying to capture how fear regimes really run deep and they can live on in the transitional period with all kinds of institutionalized impunity and also cultural impunity. So the article defines the politics of oblivion, which really is elite-led policy that is aimed at, as I said before, not necessarily justice and accountability, but is aimed at a deliberate effort to block human rights policies and politics of memory and tries to monopolize the historical narrative of the period. So in this case, in Uruguay, the figure was a complete amnesty to perpetrators of state crimes that was called caducidad. In the article in English, it's called expiry law. And so these policies do aim or settle into a so-called peaceful transition and talks about social reconciliation programs. And you could say that they are partly successful in securing some sort of pacification in the moment of transition, but it's based on the prolongation of fear and the continuation of, a regime of fear that does not achieve any kind of reform. For example, in Uruguay, there was no military reform, no judicial reform. There are a lot of institutions that continued working as they were working the previous decade. And also you don't have a sort of a moment of truth and memory for the victims and for the wider civil society. The article really also summarizes and highlights the role of social movements of mobilizing for accountability and for what is being called the movement for truth, memory, and justice. And I like to offer this idea that social movements do act as social repair mechanisms for society, for civil society. They come from civil society. They're not enemies of the state as they were dubbed in the previous decade of the Cold War, but they are trying to make a more diverse, alternative, and plural representation of the period of violence. In the article, I refer to it as state terrorism. And they also contribute to the formation of a more plural cultural memory, enduring cultural memory.
Okay, and Renzo, your article was The Choreography of a Massacre, Memory and Performance in Ayakucho Carnival. Can you briefly summarize the article?
Sure. My article called that Choreography of Massacre, Memory and Performance in Ayakucho Carnival basically analyzed the artistic recording of the traumatic experiences in the Ayakucho Carnival tradition in Lima, through which the survivors and their children demand justice and reparation from the state for human rights violations. The massacre was a horrible experience for the Ajomarca villagers, which happened in August 14 in 1985 during the armed conflict between the Communist Party of Peru, better known Shining Path, and the Peruvian state, in which the army patrol entered to the town of Ajomarca in the Andean region of Ayacucho and assassinated the 69 peasants, indigenous peasants, supposedly sympathizers of the Shining Path. So the majority of the survivors that massacre were displaced to the city of Lima, and where they created an organization for victims and joined the association, I call it Asociación Hijos del Distrito de Ajomarca, it is the Association of Children of the Ajomarca District. The victims organization has engaged in a long battle for truth and justice since that massacre happened. The massacre has been remembered in different ways over time, both in Ajomarca, but also in Lima, where living the majority of the survivors and the victims' family and other initial migrants who already organized an association. The massacre was remembered in the last 5-6 years through the Carnival performance, in which many of these migrants from Ayacucho, who displaced basically for the political violence in Ayacucho to Lima, they started to organize in this carnival at the end of 1980s, much officially at the early 1990s, and practice was a space where the Ayacuchanos, people from Ayacucho, who survived the war and displaced to Lima, they can participate in this cultural expression and perform their social memory and traditions, and also use this space for protest, to claim justice, and also for memory, historical memory, and finally to convey their experiences, traumatic experiences, to the young generations. So the carnival and its choreography and music are an alternative forms of representation of violence in the experience of the survivors, victims, and the new generation, by publicizing their war experiences and denouncing their consequences in the public arena. So this article it's a contribution that what's going on in the memory struggle in Peru, especially from the alternative memory, how social memory work beyond the official memory of practices such as the musealization or monumentalizations. So this article analyzes other forms of memory from the local perspective, from the grassroots victims organizations, such as the Ajomarca Association of the Victims in Lima.
And from your respective articles, Renzo, you conclude that the function of the memory of violence goes beyond oral testimony, construction of memorials, and commemorations of the recent past. And Gabriela, you provide a quote actually from Felipe Michelini that 3 decades ago, Uruguayans were told to turn the page. Our civil society has clearly responded. You have to read the page before you can turn it. So can you both sort of discuss how the resurgence of memory is shaping both Peru and Uruguay, as well as Latin America? So Renzo, you can go ahead and go first.
Mm-hmm. So after the Truth Commission and Reconciliation work in Peru, which was between 2001 and 2003, there was this national, in the national level, there was this shocked moment in which the verbal and visual testimonies collected by the Truth Commission broke up the silence promoted basically by the dominant memory under the Fujimori's rule in 1990s. Well, in that national level, there was still there today this two dominant narratives. On the one hand, is the memory of salvation created basically by the Fujimori's administration in the early 1990s. This narrative, which represents Fujimori as the economic and political and physical savior of Peru from the terrorist project of Shining Path, that narrative is still supported and employed by armed forces, neoliberal elites, and the Fujimoristas, the supporters of Fujimori. But on the other side, there is the human rights memory narrative, assumed by many human rights groups and family of the victims organizations, which supported the legacy of the Truth Commission and its final report. Well, these two narratives, it's dominant in the public arena, but there is also alternative memories, alternative narratives coming from the grassroots organizations and local communities in which the battle for memory it's going from the micro level to the national level. There is, for example, the work by artists, performers who use the space, the public space, for remembrance. And there is also narrative literature, like literature, using memoirs, biographies to make an influence in the memory of the violence in the recent history of Peru. So what I would try to explain is not only the verbal and visual testimonies that one can narrate the traumatic experiences. There is also this body performance, this artistic performance using paintings, using music, dance, a lot of social and testimonial songs that also narrate the traumatic experience of the violence. So in Peru, I think we need to take attention to these other forms of memory and try to incorporate it in this national memory. I try to understand this post-conflict process in Peru through these other forms of memory. For example, in the last 2 years, there is a community in Ayakucho called Kayara, in which the survivors and local leadership organized the remembrance of the massacre that happened in 1980 in Kayara. The survivors, beginning by the alcalde, the mayor for the village, to remember this massacre using the theatrical performance from what happened during 1980 in the village. So they organize, coordinate with students from the high school and the family of survivors, the victims, who can remember and share their experiences with the children, the students, and so the students can participate in the theatre of the performance of the massacre as theatre, as drama. So they did this performance, the representation of the massacre, in May 14. This is another kind of remembrance, another kind of memory, how they are using the public space and using the local form of remembrance, such as the music and dance and theater in the case of Kayara. So I try to understand this process and explain more about the the forms of memory in Peru from the local perspective and from the grassroots victim perspective. So I think it's not only the visual and testimonial or writing process or construing the monumentalization of the past events that how we can remember. In Peru, there is other kind of practices, social and cultural practices that we have to take attention.
And Gabriela?
Yes, the quote you mentioned is actually very important, reminding Uruguayans and also people in the region that before you can turn the historical page, you have to be able to read it and know what happened. So basically in Uruguay, what I'm going to say about Uruguay, I will highlight what applies to the at least the sub-region, what I know, the Southern Cone, that in Uruguay, political elites in the initial transition, represented by the figure of President Sanguinetti, who was the transitional president at the time, had declared by 1989, declared that the transition was complete and successful. And so, as I said before, what is very noteworthy is that mobilization actually did not die in 1989 when everything seemed to be, the amnesty had been voting for all perpetrators. There was no meaningful truth commission. There were no reparations for survivors and victims. There was no acknowledgement from the state that there even were disappeared or people who had been tortured and, of course, let alone exiles. And so basically society was supposed to move forward without looking at that page. So what I really want to rescue is, as Renzo really well said, this idea of the social spaces and symbolic spaces for memory that play out in ways that are much more complex than we initially thought. I think this volume represents that very, very well. So the battle for memory and spaces for memory is not just political, but the political also involves the cultural involves the intersubjective involves the psychological, the symbolic, different forms of expression, and it also involves the transmission of memory to younger generations. So in the case of Uruguay particularly, the social space was very narrow as a result of Politics of Oblivion, and it was the mothers of the disappeared, just like the ones and their counterparts in Argentina. The mothers who disappeared in Uruguay are relatively much less known, but they were the ones that said, we're not going to close our door after this terrible defeat in the transition. And for the last 30 years, along with Felipe Michelini and a lot of other civic actors who were champions of the struggle against impunity, they very patiently, almost like water on the rocks, have been working away at many ways a symbolic representation of this memory that for a long time seemed silenced and gone. And so they, for example, concocted the Marcha del Silencio, Silent March, since 1996. So in 1996-97, memory started resurging again. And for the last 20 years exactly, there's been a silent march every year in Montevideo and now in other capitals in Uruguay that remembers the victims of the dictatorship and claims for justice and accountability. So this shows us, in that I think it speaks to the idea of collective memory, that is a memory that is not just based on communities and expressively in social space. Sometimes this memory recedes, and I like to talk about the undercurrents of memory. The artistic expressions and other cultural expressions show that sometimes this receding can be broken, and so the memory can be expressed. So I wanted to rescue that. Politics of Oblivion are very harmful because not only they miss the opportunity to do a transition based more on democratic institutions, reform, and trust building and institution building, but they continue to rely on a message of fear and blocking social space and monopolizing the official discourse. And so Uruguay is a model for the region of what is a radical expression of politics of oblivion. Politics of oblivion have existed also in other cases. Argentina, for example, after an initial wave of justice, they did have sort of punto final, which was kind of also their different waves of justice and impunity. So there's definitely oblivion there. In Chile, very clearly, up to the arrest of General Pinochet in London, there had been a lot of oblivion there. And well, I'm sure that Renzo can identify with the idea of a political elite that try to lead denial and silencing. I can talk about the case of Brazil, which is still struggling with this legacy in a very oblivious way, kind of close to what Uruguayans did. So basically, I would say that the effects of this is that 3 decades later, or sometimes in different cases, decades later, the unresolved cases of gross human rights violations and violations to the Constitution take the democracy hostage as long as they don't get resolved and addressed by the state. And social movements came to occupy that space, to try to make this expressive, public, and out of the shadows. The Politics of Oblivion also, as I said before, undermined judicial independence and military reform. Social movements, in some cases, contribute to the push towards some reform. And so what's more important is that they open up the social space closed by the Politics of Oblivion and the denial. And they are very important in trying to turn around that policy. So the important message here is that once Politics of Oblivion and impunity are installed, which they are in many countries in the region, they're not done forever and for good. The Uruguayan case shows clearly that civil society in all its expressions and in a very wide understanding of mobilizations can actually break a little brecha, a little space that can be widened, open up that tight control, speak to the fear with a language of moral, ethical stance, and try to, in that way, open up the idea of reparations, the idea of acknowledgement, of recognition and truth, and the memory and the never again for future generations. So what happened is that the transition became prolonged, but the final word is not written by those in the control of the state, but sometimes, actually, as the case of Uruguay also shows, over time, the mobilization can become empowering for a political party that is resisting this and become part of the state. And, today, those who have been in power since 2005 actually were trying to push for accountability. That was President Vázquez in 2005, President Mujica starting in 2009. Now we have a second mandate by President Vázquez. Felipe Michelini, that you quoted before, is precisely one of the commissioners of a new Truth and Justice Commission 30 years after the transition. That shows that this sort of moral radar of society, that civil society in its mobilizations can sort of bring forth, there is no timing for it. The timing is a lot more complex than we thought. The mobilization of memory and the push for justice is not only a political struggle, but it's also, as I like to call it, an intersubjective level of struggle. It wavers between the undercurrents and what is public and expressed publicly. And it also is trying to take over more diverse cultural spaces and ultimately also be a force that can be transmitted to future generations. So, for example, in Uruguay, Renzo also pointed out in the case of Peru, there are a whole generation of children of the dictatorship, or even now grandchildren of the dictatorship, who may have not joined political parties, but may have produced documentaries or film, or books, cultural expressions. The social movements themselves become performances in different cases, like the Marcha del Silencio I mentioned before. So all of these effects of impunity, I would like to say they can receive something like an antidote treatment of social repair in society. When social movements are able to coordinate and work towards the visibilization of these problems, start building institutions with trust-building practices.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, but thank you both for your responses and for providing us insight into our new issue of Latin American perspectives.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
So that is all that we have for today. Thank you, our audience, for listening in. Please don't forget to add us on Facebook, on Twitter, Pinterest, and all of our other wonderful social media sites. Again, please join us in January for our next podcast. Hasta luego.